Do similar structures in living things point to a common ancestor or point to a common designer?
Evidence for a common designer today on Creation Magazine Live. Welcome to Creation Magazine Live. I'm Richard Fangrad.
And I'm Calvin Smith.
And our topic today is homology.
Right.
Similar structures in, we'll be looking at living things in particular, but evolutionists see this as one massive evidence for a common ancestor. And it's described this way. When evolutionists said, if you look at a 1953 Corvette and compare it to the latest model, only the most general resemblances are evident. But if you compare 1953 and a 1954 Corvette side by side, then a 1954 and a 1955 model, and so on, the descent with modification is overwhelmingly obvious. This is what paleontologists do with fossils, and the evidence is so solid and comprehensive that it cannot be denied by reasonable people.
Wow. So obviously this guy thinks that this particular evidence is like just smack down.
It's a big deal.
Proof of evolution, yeah. Well, we're going to look at some similar skeletal structures here between a human, and we've got a dog, and we've got a bird, and we've got a whale. And what people are told is that these similarities are there, right? Because we all of these creatures went back to a creature before them that had structures like that, and then they diversified, right? So they had that structure, and they diversified, and that's why they all share them. They've got shared common ancestry through evolution, et cetera.
The textbooks, teachers, TV, media, everywhere, they interpret this observation as common ancestor.
Right.
That's the interpretation. And here's an example from a university website and so on. This university website says, evolutionary theory predicts that all related organisms will share similarities that are derived from common ancestors. Similar characteristics due to relatedness are known as homologies. That's our topic today.
Right. Well, I think we need to ask a question here when we're told information, and this is the way it is, about things that supposedly happened in the past. Is this the only way to explain the data that we see? Is that the only way to interpret those observations? And I mean, based on what most educational programs, textbooks, we see, the answer seems to be yes. There's only one way to explain this stuff.
There's no other possible way to explain it.
Yeah, but there is a far better way to explain these things, right? And that's a common designer. Similarity in living things because of a common designer, and that makes sense from even the things that we create, in a sense, right?
Right. Yeah. If we think of a Porsche and the VW Bug, the Beetle car, both have air-cooled, flat, horizontally opposed four-cylinder engines in the back, independent rear suspension, two doors, a trunk in the front, and many other similarities, or we could say homologies.
Right. Now, why do these two different cars have so many similarities? Because they're from the same designer.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So whether similarity is morphological, whether it's a shape or structure or something like that, or it's biochemical, right? There's many living things that share biochemical homology, so to speak. It's not an argument for evolution over creation. If you just think of that, oh yeah, right. Intelligent designers use similar component parts in a variety of different applications.
Sure.
Of course there's going to be similarities when you have a common designer.
Yeah. And if humans were entirely different from every other thing that we have on the planet, indeed every other living thing, would this reveal a creator to us?
Not really,
no.
right?
You'd think that there was maybe multiple creators.
Right, because one creator likes doing stuff this way, and one creator likes doing stuff another way.
Exactly. The unity of creation, the similarities there, are a testimony to the one true God that we read about in the Bible.
Right. I mean, if humans were entirely different from all of other living things, how would we live, right? How could we eat, right? How would you eat a carrot if biochemically it just didn't didn't match up,
if it
right?
was totally different than our own biochemistry.
Yeah,
exactly.
we wouldn't be able to gain nutrients. We wouldn't be able to get energy to live. How could we digest them? How would you use the amino acids in food to, and sugars and all those things that our bodies need? It just doesn't make sense. So this biochemical similarity, it's necessary. It's part of what you'd expect to see in design. Right?
Yes, if there's one creator, one designer, we'd expect to see exactly what we do see. And we'll of course talk more about this on today's show.
Yeah.
There's a chapter on exactly this topic in the Creation Answers book. The Creation Answers book is our most popular book, right. And there's chapters on where did Cain get his wife, chapters on starlight, how come we're seeing the stars from distant galaxies, and dinosaurs and Noah's flood, and all kinds of different things. It's a great book. You can pick it up at creation.com. We'll be right back.
What do mice and fruit flies have in common? On the surface, you wouldn't think much, but geneticists have discovered some of their genes are practically identical. Discoveries like this are often touted as proof of evolution because similar genes supposedly show mice and fruit flies are related. But evolutionary scientists did not predict this. Genetics professor Sean Carroll confessed no biologist had even the foggiest notion that such similarities could exist between genes of such different animals. According to evolutionists, mice and fruit flies last shared a common ancestor over 600 million years ago. Therefore, any similar genes they shared should have been scrambled beyond recognition by almost countless generations of mutations. Different animals share similar genes, not because they are related, but because they share a common designer who used a similar blueprint to build the animal kingdom. And that was not very long ago either.
To find out more from Creation Ministries International, visit our website, creation.com.
All right, if you've just tuned in, we're talking about similarities in living things, or homologies and so on. And this is historically been, and well, it is today still, supposedly a massive evidence for a common ancestor.
Right.
And we're looking at the other option, could it be a common designer?
Right.
It's actually a much superior option. But DNA in cells contains much of the information necessary to build and operate a living thing. That's,
right.
we know that nowadays. So if two organisms look similar externally, their DNA should also be similar, obviously.
Right. Kind of like the car pictures you were showing. If they look similar, they must have similar component parts.
Yeah, and similarities between two mammals, for example, a cow and a whale, they should have DNA that's more similar than, say, between a cow and a worm, for example.
Right.
You would expect that.
And from a biblical perspective, as we mentioned, organisms descended from the same original created kinds would be expected to be very similar biochemically. And of course, you'd show some downhill changes from the fall, right? Changes in information, losses in information, but of course they'd be similar.
Yeah, now humans and apes are very similar. Chimps in particular look very much like humans in a lot of respects. And so you would expect that their DNA would be very similar to our DNA.
Right.
We have similar external features and similar DNA as well. So what would it mean, for example, if human and chimp DNA were, say, 96% identical? And there's been numbers like this thrown around for years. We've done shows on this before.
We know that those figures aren't accurate, but anyway, they've been thrown around. But what if is what you're saying?
What if they were 96% similar? We did a show, actually, we can mention, if you go to creation.com/CML2-23, we did a whole episode on this 99% or whatever similarity, and you can get more details there. So with a very high similarity in DNA, would it mean that humans could have evolved from a common ancestor with the chimps?
Right.
Not at all.
I mean, the amount of information in these 3 billion base pairs in the DNA of every human, right, is about the same amount that it would be in 840 Bibles.
Yeah.
That's a massive amount of information. It's huge, right? The Bible's a large book. It's got more than 3.5 million letters. So even if humans and chimps were only 4% different, what you're talking about is 120 million base pairs. That's equivalent to 34 Bibles worth of information difference, right? That's a huge amount. This is an impossible barrier for mutations, to sum up these random changes to cross. Even given 7 million, several million years, supposedly the difference between men, apes turned into humans and things like that.
Back to the common ancestor, there just isn't enough time.
There isn't enough time to have that many beneficial mutations, and not just beneficial, but information gaining addition to turn us from one thing to another.
Now, here's some other things to consider about similarities in living things. Certain biochemical functions are common to all living things.
Right.
For example, human cells, in some cases, do many of the same things that yeast cells do, believe it or not. We share similarities in DNA sequences that code for some of the enzymes and proteins that do the same types of jobs in both cells.
Right.
Some sequences, for example, those that code for proteins involved in chromosome structure are identical to yeast.
That's right. I mean, we're going to put up a diagram here, and here you can see the similarities between humans and other organisms, the DNA similarities. Between cat and a person, there's 90% similarity. That's a phenomenal figure. We should all be like cat people.
Well, yeah.
You know, or
a number of jokes you could make on this.
Yeah, I guess, cow, 80% with cows.
Yeah, we're 50% bananas.
I mean, if this was like some kind of superhero show, I mean, you could be cowman, catman. I mean, this is phenomenal here. Mice, 75%. Like you said, yeast, 26%. A weed, 18% similarity.
A weed, yeah.
It's kind of crazy when you think about it. I mean, what this would mean is cats are more similar to people than cows, right? Like they must have been higher on the evolutionary scale somehow, or
yeah. And I think it needs to be said that these sort of percentages can be varied depending on what section of the genome you're looking at.
That's right. Yeah.
And we did a great article. There's a great article on creation.com on this topic. You can go to creation.com/chimp and look up that article there. And from the article, we can highlight just one thing. The problems with similarities between apes and humans being 96%, the chimp genome was about 10% larger than the human genome. So there's got to be at least 10% difference between humans and chimps, and that's just one example. We'll be back with more shortly.
Creation Ministries International staff, many from a wide variety of scientific disciplines, have produced thousands of articles now available in a massive online database. Some of the topics covered include the feasibility of Noah's Ark and evidence for a global flood, scientific arguments that explain observations in astronomy within a young Earth timeframe, recent discoveries that support dinosaurs fitting with biblical history, evidence from biology that shows that the type of change that is observed in living things has absolutely nothing to do with evolution. Got questions? Get answers at creation.com.
Welcome back. This week we're talking about homologies, right? Similarities between living organisms that evolutionists claim are proof that we all evolved from a common ancestor. And of course, we're exploring the other side of the coin, saying, well, wait a sec. You can explain data differently, right? To different models. What about the concept of a common designer? That actually makes more sense than the evolutionary explanation.
Now, continuing on with DNA, does a high similarity in two DNA sequences mean that they have the same meaning or function? No, not necessarily. Look at these two sentences. There are many scientists today who question the evolutionary paradigm and its atheistic philosophical implications. Sentence number 2. There are not many scientists today who question the evolutionary paradigm and its atheistic philosophical implications. These sentences have a 97% homology. They're 97% similar, but have almost exactly opposite meanings.
Right.
They're similar, but they have opposite meanings. There's a strong analogy here in the way that DNA sequences can be turned on or off by a relatively small control sequence. And guess what? There's large differences in the control sequences between apes and humans.
Right. There's other significant differences here, right, that include things like this. There are almost no similarities in the hotspots. Now, hotspots are areas where chromosomes rearrange pieces of DNA during sexual reproduction, and there are almost no similarities in those hotspots. The Y chromosomes, for example, are also extremely different, with the human one being much larger, right? And there's no way that mutations could bridge this gap, as we were talking about earlier, between chimps and humans. Chimps are just animals. People are created in the image of God. There's a huge, vast difference between these two created creatures.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. Another serious problem for evolution. The front appendages of many animals are said to be homologous. Here's that picture again. Now, if evolution is true, that means that the genes that code for those structures should also be similar, obviously.
Right. If you got similar things, you should have similar coding for those.
Yeah, we should have a similar coding for those.
Right. But the problem for evolution is they don't.
No.
They don't have similar instructions here. So here you can see that similar structures actually come from different genes. So in vertebrates, the embryo is constructed of a large number of gene segments that can be numbered, starting at the head end. And the diagram shows 6 different vertebrates which allegedly inherited their front legs from a common ancestor. The front legs as well as the rear legs developed from entirely different groups of segments from species to species. The instructions are completely different, and yet they turn out to have similar features. Right?
Yeah. And this is from a 1971 monograph entitled "Homology: An Unsolved Problem," published in the Oxford Biology Reader by Sir Gavin de Beer. Now, he was a top embryologist of the last century here, and he was an evolutionist. And in 1971, he wrote this: "But if it is true that through the genetic code, genes code for enzymes that synthesize proteins, which are responsible, in a manner still unknown in embryology, for the differentiation of various parts in their normal manner, what mechanism can it be that results in the production of homologous organs, the same patterns, in spite of their not being controlled by the same genes?" I asked this question in 1938, and it has not been answered. So here he's writing in 1971.
Right.
And it wasn't answered in 1938. It's still not answered today.
That's right.
Different genes produce similar structures.
Right. And this is a serious problem for the idea that common structures mean a common ancestor.
Right.
It makes a lot more sense that God, he used a good design and he modified it for different reasons. And
exactly.
And in creations that intelligent beings make, one person might use certain things to make something, and somebody might say, "Oh, that's a good design," and they might make it at a completely different material or with a completely different, layout,
right.
and arrive at the same design.
Yeah. Take simple things like tires, for example. You have tires on bicycles and skateboards and jet airplanes and race cars and toy trains.
Yeah.
All the tires are round.
Round
Amazing.
tires.
Round tires. Yeah. Because that's a good design. But in each one of those cases, they've been modified for the particular vehicle.
Right.
And that's what we see in living things. We see a similar, very good design. It works good, and it's been modified for whatever animal it's a part of. That's just a common designer.
Copying the work or design of another person without giving them due credit is called plagiarism. But even though plagiarism is widely regarded as a terrible thing, ironically, it has actually inspired a whole new field of science known as biomimetics. As the name suggests, biomimetics involves mimicking or copying designs seen in the biological world. For instance, the geometric eyes of lobsters have inspired X-ray telescope design, and the amazing properties of spider silk are inspiring chemists in the production of ultra-strong materials. Since scientists are continually uncovering excellent examples of design in nature that are worth copying, isn't it reasonable to conclude that our Creator must have designed them? And if they are copying the work of a creator and not giving him due credit, isn't that just another form of plagiarism? Romans chapter 1 speaks of those who do not honor God for what He has created.
To find out more from Creation Ministries International, visit our website, creation.com.
Welcome back. We're talking about homology, right? The concept of similarity in living things,
right,
being used by evolutionists as proof that we all came from a common ancestor.
Yes.
And of course, we've been exploring the concept that, well, wait a sec, there's different ways to look at evidences. What about common design? And what we've seen so far is from what we see in science is that common design is a far better explanation from what we see. And it's interesting to me is that, of course, we both travel around and speak at churches and so on, that even many times I've explained the idea of common design, even Christians are like, oh yeah, that makes so much sense. And I mean, these are Bible-believing Christians, right? They love the Lord, they love His Word, but it's just because evolutionary indoctrination is everywhere.
Yes.
That they've picked these things up and they haven't even thought it through.
And the evolutionists have said, well, this is the only way to understand similarities in living things.
Right.
But of course, it's the question that we asked when we started. Is that the only way of explaining the observations that we see? And that question can be asked in pretty much every field of science that has to do with origins.
Right.
Big Bang, for example.
Yeah.
Is the Big Bang scenario the only possible explanation for explaining what we see in our telescopes?
Right.
Of course not. There could be dozens of different ways of explaining those things.
And if you were to propose only one way to scientists, they'd say, no, science has got to have competing, outlooks and stuff like that.
Yeah,
but that's not the way it's presented in schools,
is it?
It
works. No. No, we can keep talking about some of the difficulties with, so they're similar structures,
right,
but they form through completely different paths. Here's another one of those types of observations. The sequence in which bones develop. For example, in frogs and salamanders, which are pretty close,
right.
This is a puzzle for evolutionists. So you can see here the bone structure in their forelimbs there. Generally, the outer bones form before the inner bones. For example, the ulna leads the radius, and the digits develop in the sequence 4, 3, 2, 1, and it does that in frogs. But in salamanders, the inner bones form before the outer bones. For example, the radius leading the ulna, and the digits 1, 2 forming before 3 and 4.
Right. So now we're not just talking about similarities in DNA or similarities in structures. We're talking about the similarity in the formation,
development, embryology, and so on.
Right.
Yeah.
So if they came from a common ancestor, why wouldn't they follow the same sequence?
Exactly.
And if they did come from a common ancestor, what information caused it to form in different sequences? That's even more complicated than just doing what it's already been created through random mutations.
And we've actually simplified the problem. There's other problems here, but
right. Well, here's another problem: is there's different genetic codes. I mean, all organisms use DNA, but a few use different DNA code.
And this is huge. Yeah.
This is huge, and this rules out common ancestry as well. I mean, in order to support the common ancestor conclusion for similarities in living things, evolutionists they've got to imagine an evolutionary tree, right? You've seen that. That tree.
It has one trunk and then ends up with all kinds of
branches.
branches.
You start with one creature, it turns into all the other different creatures, right? So all life evolved from a single genetic code. Then that's what the conclusion would be.
That's the idea,
and all living things have in common. And this is used as support for a common ancestor going back to a single cell. But if you got different codes, you got some problems with that idea, right?
Cute little drawing of what looks like a tree there doesn't make any sense.
Right.
You've got to have evolved different codes or whatever. Interesting.
Exactly.
Dr. Jonathan Sarfati, one of our own scientists, he wrote this about this problem. Many evolutionists claim that the DNA code is universal, and that is proof of a common ancestor. But this is false. There are exceptions, some known since the 1970s.
Yeah.
An example is paramecium, where a few of the 64 possible codons code for different amino acids. More examples are being found constantly. Also, some organisms code for 1 or 2 extra amino acids beyond the 20 main types, or the main 20 types. But if one organism evolved into another with a different code, all of the messages already encoded would be scrambled, just as written messages would be jumbled if typewriter keys were switched. This is a huge problem for the evolution of one code into another. And a simple way to understand that is the severity of the problem is, imagine the word gift. Well, in
English, that's a good thing.
If you give me a gift or I give you a gift, where everybody's happy, right?
Yeah.
But you don't want to do that in German.
Right.
Gift in German means poison. So you don't want to give somebody gift. And that's the problem you have with different genetic codes. That's another huge problem with the notion of common ancestor. It's common designer that makes the most sense.
The reason that the Creation Answers book is so popular is because it covers a huge range of topics and answers more than 60 of the most asked questions about Genesis and the creation evolution issue. Questions like, what is the evidence for God's existence? Could the days in Genesis 1 be long periods of time? How did all the animals fit on Noah's Ark? Does radioisotope dating prove that the Earth is very old? Where do dinosaurs fit into the Bible? And many more. To order your copy, visit creation.com.
Well, welcome back. We're talking about similarities in living things. Is that evidence of evolution, or is it evidence of creation?
It's
God, the common designer. Yeah, I think so. We're talking about these different problems that evolutionists now have to overcome for this concept of homology. I mean, even problems on how digits grow in different things. They'll often say, well, look, a human has 5 fingers, or let's say a frog has a bunch of toes. There's similarity there, so that's proof. But even the way they grow, I mean, for example, in humans, you have programmed cell death as you're being formed in your mother's womb, right? This is how you get your digits. Cells die in between here, and it divides, and that's how you get your fingers.
Yes.
Well, for example, a frog, in the end, you might put your hand down and put a frog's hand down and say, okay, well, there's some similarities. But their digits don't grow like that. They actually grow from little buds.
Through like cell growth, normal.
That's right, and they come out like that. Whereas the human does that. This is a completely different mechanism.
It's almost the opposite. You have cell growth versus cell death.
Exactly.
To produce at the end of the day, you have a similar structure, but it's produced entirely differently.
That's right. That makes sense from a common design perspective. Doesn't make sense from a common ancestor.
Now, when we started, we quoted Tim Berra, who suggested similarities in automobiles. He used the Corvette as an example, as an analogy for understanding similarities in living things. And concluding that it's a common ancestor. He said that this evidence for evolution was, quote, so solid and comprehensive that it cannot be denied by reasonable people.
Right. Well, we've just shown there's a lot of evidence that goes against what he said.
Right. Yep.
So, I mean, the problem with Berra's analogy has been summarized this way. You can see it here. Berra's primary purpose is to show that living organisms are the result of naturalistic evolution rather than intelligent design. Structural similarities amongst automobiles, however, even similarities between older and newer models, which Berra calls descent with modification, are due to construction according to pre-existing patterns,
That's right.
i.e. to design. Ironically, therefore, Berra's analogy shows that even striking similarities are not sufficient to exclude design-based explanations. In order to demonstrate naturalistic evolution, it is necessary to show that the mechanism by which organisms are constructed, unlike the mechanism by which automobiles are constructed, does not involve design. I mean, we can see the problem here, right? He's using things that were designed as an analogy to show things aren't designed.
Yeah, just so they evolved from a common ancestor.
Right.
But they came from a common designer.
Exactly.
It's just amazing. As scientists have learned more about anatomy and physiology, and especially genetics, over the last not that long, the concept of homology came under increasing attack.
Right.
That homology means common ancestor. And so over time, examples that seemed to fit the evolutionary notion of homology were kept, and those that didn't support it, many examples that didn't support homology, were ignored. And more examples, this has happened more and more examples were discovered that had to be ignored. And here we are today, where there are a few examples that are still there, but many of the examples of similar features or structures had to be discarded.
Yeah.
And here we are today.
By the way, guess which ones are presented in textbooks to your kids at school? Only the ones that supposedly support evolution,
but
right?
the ones we've mentioned, you won't see them
You
anywhere.
don't see them. So, it's almost like God did this to deliberately frustrate evolutionists. It's like, here's a good design I'm going to use through different animals, but I'm not going to do it the same way. And it's proof that the creation is proof of the Creator.
It is.
We'll see you next time.